Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into the agricultural revolution, arguably the most dramatic paradigm shift in human existence. Let's start with a staggering fact. For more than 95% of human history, humans never farmed a single crop. Then, one discovery completely changed our species forever. Just think about the sheer magnitude of that time span for a second. For hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors survived catastrophic ice ages, crossed treacherous land bridges, and populated almost every corner of the globe, all without ever altering the earth to grow their own food. They were purely consumers of what the natural world spontaneously provided. They tracked migrating herds across vast sweeping plains, foraged for wild berries in dense forests, and took only what the seasons offered. They lived completely off the grid, continuously adapting to the environment rather than forcing the environment to adapt to them. When you map out the grand timeline of our species like this, the immense scale of our time as foragers is truly humbling. That massive portion of our history represents a highly stable, wildly successful status quo. The era of farming, by comparison, it's just a tiny 5% sliver of our existence. Yet, in that incredibly brief window of evolutionary time, the human race went from huddling in temporary shelters made of animal skins to engineering towering skyscrapers, splitting the atom, and walking on the surface of the moon. Literally, everything that we consider to be modern human progress has been squeezed into this final fraction of our timeline. Which brings us to the central mystery of our story today. How exactly did this single transition to agriculture fundamentally alter the course of human history? How did the act of planting a few mutant seeds in the ancient mud snowball into the creation of global empires, the invention of written language, and eventually the smartphone in your pocket? Well, to understand the magnitude of what we gained, we first have to understand exactly what we left behind. Part 1. The Hunter-Gatherer Era. It's incredibly easy for us, sitting in our modern climate-controlled rooms, to look back at prehistoric times and assume everyday life was nothing but a constant, desperate, violent struggle for survival. But the reality is that the highly mobile foraging lifestyle worked incredibly well for thousands upon thousands of years. Before farming, humans survived in a totally self-sufficient system. Because you have to constantly move to follow animal migrations and seasonal plant blooms, you simply cannot accumulate heavy possessions. You literally only own what you can carry on your back. And because of this extreme mobility, foraging naturally kept populations small. A nomadic mother can't exactly carry 3 infants and days' worth of supplies while tracking a herd of deer, which meant birth rates were naturally spaced out. Furthermore, without land ownership, permanent dwellings, or hoarded wealth, there were no kings, nor aristocrats, and no peasants. These were highly skilled survivalists working together in remarkably egalitarian bands, fiercely protective of their members and sharing the resources of their vast territories equally. Part 2. The Great Domestication. So the inciting incident that shattered this ancient balance occurred around 11,700 years ago at the end of the last ice age. Picture the cinematic scale of this global shift. Receding ice sheets causing global temperatures to warm, massive glaciers melting, and rising sea levels slowly flooding vast, low-lying coastal plains. This rising water pushed human populations further inland, forcing them into closer quarters in highly fertile regions like Mesopotamia, often called the Fertile Crescent. This warming climate triggered an absolute explosion of wild, nutrient-rich grasses. And humans, being naturally curious and highly intelligent problem solvers, began intuitive experiments with their changing environment. Now, it wasn't an overnight invention where a lone genius suddenly invented the concept of a farm. It was a staggered, slow-motion process over millennia. Long before anyone thought to plant a seed, humans were actually domesticating animals. Wolves were slowly tamed by the campfire around 15,000 years ago to assist with hunting. But it was around 11,600 years ago that we see the first concerted efforts to cultivate wild grains, followed shortly after by the domestication of livestock. What these early humans were doing, entirely by intuition, was selective breeding. They were essentially winning a slow-motion genetic lottery. Take wild wheat, for example. In nature, wild wheat naturally shatters and violently drops its seeds to the ground the moment it ripens, which is great for the plant, but terrible for a foraging human trying to gather a meal. But occasionally, a random genetic mutation causes the seeds to stay firmly attached to the stalk. Hunter-gatherers naturally harvested these mutant stalks because they were exponentially easier to carry back to camp. When they accidentally spilled some of these seeds around their fire pits, they sprouted the next year. Over generations, humans realized they could deliberately plant these specific seeds to guarantee a dense, reliable harvest. Simultaneously, they were changing their relationship with animals. Capturing wild sheep and goats wasn't just for a single feast anymore. Early humans realized that by taming these animals, they were creating walking, living batteries of renewable resources. A domesticated goat provided daily milk, a sheep provided yearly wool for warmth, and oxen provided the physical, muscular traction needed to eventually pull heavy plows. Part 3. Surplus and Settlement. The moment a human intentionally buried a seed in the ground, they triggered a massive, irreversible psychological and physical trap. Think about the inevitable consequence of a wheat field. If you spend weeks clearing land and planting a vast field of grain, you can no longer pack up your tent and follow a herd of gazelle for 6 months. You are now permanently tethered to the mud. You have to stay. You have to pull the weeds. You have to relentlessly protect the fragile young stalks from birds and rodents. You must dig irrigation trenches to water them, and you must wait for the harvest. Sedentary life was officially born. This created a powerful domino effect. Because humans were forced to stay in one place, they abandoned their temporary animal skin tents and began building heavy, permanent structures out of stone and mud brick. And within these new permanent villages, they built something truly revolutionary: granaries. Archaeological sites in the Jordan Valley feature complex clay silos dating back 11,000 years. By storing thousands of pounds of grain to survive the harsh winters or years of drought, humanity unlocked the ultimate evolutionary advantage: a reliable, storable food surplus. Part 4. The Birth of Civilization. This pile of extra grain acts as the rising action of our grand human narrative. It is the fundamental catalyst that completely rewrote the rules of biology and society. Because here is the profound magic of a surplus. With a steady supply of soft, easily digestible grain mushes and animal milk, a mother was no longer forced to nurse a child for years on end. She could wean a toddler early and have another baby much sooner. Predictably, human populations began to skyrocket at an unprecedented rate. But more importantly, because a single family of dedicated farmers could now pull enough calories out of the dirt to feed a dozen other people, not everyone was required to hunt, gather, or farm anymore. This completely unleashed human potential through the specialization of labor. If you don't have to worry about where your next meal is coming from, you can dedicate your entire life to mastering a single craft. Small agricultural villages expanded into bustling towns. Imagine the sensory overload of these new settlements, the intense glowing heat and ringing hammer strikes of a newly specialized blacksmith forging tools, the chaotic shouting of merchants haggling over brightly painted pottery in a crowded market, the rhythmic, organized marching of a professional soldier whose only job is to guard the city walls. This division of labor gave rise to the massive, immensely complex city-states of early civilization. But living in a densely packed city surrounded by thousands of loud, opinionated people requires something completely unprecedented in the animal kingdom. In the wild, when two large, unfamiliar groups of primates are forced into the same small territory, natural instincts take over, and it usually results in brutal, fatal violence. In a nomadic band of 50 people, you know everyone intimately. But in a walled city of 5,000, you are entirely surrounded by strangers. To keep these booming agricultural settlements from collapsing into violent chaos, humans had to utilize their unique capacity for complex reasoning and articulated language. They had to invent entirely abstract concepts that do not exist in nature. They created formal laws, signed diplomatic treaties, levied taxes, and appointed rulers to maintain order. And, crucially, to keep track of all that surplus grain and tax revenue, they eventually had to invent written language. We truly transitioned from roaming survivors into the complex political animals that Aristotle famously described. Part 5. The Hidden Costs. Now, when we place these two lifestyles side by side, the narrative of human history takes a very dark turn. We are heavily conditioned to view the invention of farming as an instant, glorious march of progress, a triumphant upgrade for humanity. But digging into the archaeological evidence reveals a grim reality. The transition to agriculture was actually an environmental and biological catastrophe for the everyday individual. Early farmers suddenly relied entirely on a highly restricted, monotonous, carb-heavy diet of grains, abandoning the rich, diverse nutritional profile of foraged meats, nuts, and wild fruits. This caused severe vitamin deficiencies and the very first instances of agonizing, widespread tooth decay. Furthermore, because these early city dwellers were suddenly living shoulder to shoulder in tight, unsanitary mud brick quarters, constantly surrounded by the raw waste of their newly domesticated animals, lethal pathogens found a new playground. Deadly viruses crossed over from livestock to humans, sparking the first devastating outbreaks of infectious disease.
And socially, the accumulation of stored wealth and guarded land led to the brutal dawn of deep social stratification. For the first time ever, an individual could look around and realize someone else legally owned the land they were standing on, birthing the enduring divide between wealthy kings and exhausted peasants.
The physical toll of this lifestyle was honestly staggering. Farming was grueling, repetitive, back-breaking labor that far exceeded the physical demands of foraging. This combination of harder work and poor nutrition was so severe that it literally altered human biology in the short term. Before farming, the average height of a male European hunter-gatherer was remarkably robust, standing at about 178 centimeters, or 5 foot 10 inches. But shortly after the transition to agriculture, skeletal records show average male height plummeted down to just 165 centimeters, or 5 foot 5 inches. Bone records from early farming graves show alarming spikes in conditions like osteoporosis, rickets, and severe joint degeneration. It is a deeply dark irony. While the human species as a collective whole was thriving, conquering the environment, and building monumental cities, the actual individual human beings living inside those walls were shorter, sicker, more oppressed, and worked vastly harder than their free-roaming ancestors. In fact, this stunning decline in human stature and general biological health wasn't truly reversed until the advanced medical and nutritional breakthroughs of the 20th century. Part 6. The Roots of Tomorrow. So, with the rampant disease, the crushing social inequality, the vulnerability to catastrophic famine from crop failures, and the newly invented horrors of territorial warfare over prime farming land, why did we stick with it? Simply put, demographic momentum. Humanity had crossed a point of no return. A society of sedentary farmers, even if they were individually unhealthier, could simply outbreed, outproduce, and outmuscle a society of roaming foragers. That sheer unstoppable momentum carried us directly, generation by generation, to the present day. Just look around you. Every single pillar of our modern reality owes its existence entirely to this ancient paradigm shift. The complex global shipping lanes we rely on, the centralized governments that enforce our laws, the digitized tax codes, the monumental steel architecture of our modern skylines, and the rapid technological advancements that define our era. All of it is the direct descendant of an ancient clay granary. All of it was made possible because thousands of years ago, some of our ancestors decided to stay in one place and bend the earth to their will. We have traced an incredible, turbulent journey today, from roaming bands of foragers moving silently through prehistoric forests to the deafening roar of dense, walled cities supported by sprawling, engineered fields of crops. Humanity completely reinvented itself, trading absolute freedom for absolute power over the natural world. Which leaves us with one profoundly fascinating question to ponder. Now that humanity possesses the tools to feed thousands of people from a single field, to stockpile vast, unimaginable wealth, and to build monumental cities of stone, what happens when these powerful, permanently anchored settlements inevitably run out of space, crash into one another, and relentlessly expand into the world's very first empires? That is exactly what we will be exploring next time. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you in the next explainer.